The hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Our hearing today is for the United States Agency for International Development budget request for FY25. We welcome the Honorable Samantha Power with us today. The director is doing an incredible job with all the challenges we have around the world, so we thank you very much for your public service. From the civil war in Sudan to terror attacks and coups in West Africa and the Sahel region, to the famine in Gaza, to the humanitarian crisis in Haiti, there are more and more challenges in the world today. There will be no outbreaks. You will be asked to leave. I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
Can't interrupt.
I have to ask you to leave.
Good job.
And yet, despite the best efforts of our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, I know that we have Senator Shaheen here, but Senator Coons, who chairs the subcommittee, the foreign assistance budget for this year, enacted 6 months into the year, declined by 5%, and some parts of USAID budgets by as much as 10%. The result is that when we try to address one crisis, we often have to use money from somewhere else. We should not have to choose between addressing the climate crisis or helping vulnerable communities adapt to our rapidly changing world, or housing refugees fleeing violence, or funding anti-corruption programs, or strengthening our global health initiatives. We need to expand the pie. Administrator Power, I know you deal with these daunting challenges every day at USAID. I appreciate your leadership and thank you for appearing before us today. I recognize that you and your team work in some of the toughest and dangerous places in the world. By supporting economic development in the Pacific Island nations to Latin America, USAID is pushing back against China's growing influence. By helping Ukraine with direct budget support, you are keeping the government open while it fights back against Putin's brutal attacks. Our nation's generosity is a stark contrast to programs like China's Belt and Road Initiative. The United States International Development Strategy is about supporting the aspirations of millions of average citizens around the world. It's about promoting prosperity, independence, and peace, as opposed to the debt-trapped diplomacy Beijing uses to exert tremendous influence to weaken democracy, foment corruption, and assert control over decision-making in sovereign nations. This is why the success of USAID is so central to the United States' national security interests. Because the more free and thriving democratic nations that exist in the world, the safer and more prosperous we will be at home. I think good governance and anti-corruption efforts must be at the heart of USAID's mission on the ground, and I hope you will give us an update in this regard. I also look forward to hearing about the progress USAID is making in putting local communities in the lead of delivering programs, as you pledged to do 2 years ago, and we had a pretty healthy discussion about that during your testimony at that time. Localizing our assistance is critical to building sufficiency and getting the most bang for our buck. I also want your assessment of USAID's humanitarian relief around the world. Sudan faces a famine. I know Senator Booker was just recently in Sudan and reported to some of us the circumstances he saw, which are extremely dire. Haiti is a challenging environment, although the World Food Program, supported by Food for Peace, has an enormous warehouse in Port-au-Prince with grain stacked to the ceiling, and yet we have a crisis in Haiti. We need to get to people before they go hungry. Even as we respond to the world crisis and natural disasters, we also need to plan for the long term. Energy security, infrastructure, water and sanitation, improving opportunity for women and girls, democracy and good governance assistance. Many of these issues USAID handles will boomerang back at us in the future if we don't make real progress on addressing these challenges today. Your work is critically important to the United States national security interests. So, Administrator Powell, we have a lot to cover, and I look forward to your testimony. At this time, I will recognize my distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator Power, thank you for being here today. And let me say, before I launch into my in-depth criticisms, I fully appreciate the position you're in. You got one of the toughest jobs in the administration. There's never enough money for anything that we do, but this is really tough, and particularly when you're making choices that are life and death choices. We understand that, believe me, the criticisms I have here are meant to move us forward as opposed to backwards. So thank you for that. In theory, we're here today to discuss a budget for fiscal year 2025. Unfortunately, Congress only passed a budget for fiscal year 2024 19 days ago and are still debating a supplemental budget request that was submitted 8 months ago. Meanwhile, Putin's war machine has been hammering Ukraine for more than 2 years. Hamas has been holding innocent civilians hostage and using humanitarians as human shields for more than 6 months. A brutal civil war has been raging in Sudan for 10 months, pushing 25 million people to the brink of starvation. And these are just a few of the challenges USAID has been forced to confront. Obviously, there's many others. The chairman made reference to a number of those. The pressures on the international affairs budget have become too great, and our process is overwhelmed. We're at a point, really, where it's time to start making some difficult choices, ones we have to make, and to prioritize. I really feel, unfortunately, this budget does not do that. For example, for the third year in a row, the administration has requested billions of dollars in mandatory spending to outcompete China. Well, I agree it's imperative to find ways to compete with and counter China around the world. Congress has already rejected requests for mandatory funding, not once, but twice, because by law, it requires offsets from other critical programs, as we all know. It is painfully obvious that these funds are being pushed into a mandatory request so the administration can prioritize its favored projects in climate and gender within the discretionary budget. These budget gimmicks are a dangerous game and need to stop if we're all going to pull the wagon together. It's time for the administration to take seriously the threat China poses to American values and interests and align our discretionary budget priorities accordingly. Administrator Power, I'd like to hear, based on reality, how USAID will adapt its budget to address this threat after I'm sure Congress will reject the third mandatory funding request. The proposed budget also fails to include funding to meet the U.S. obligations of the Budapest Agreement relating to Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. It's clear that this obligation cannot be met through supplemental appropriations request. It needs to be part of a comprehensive strategy and, more importantly, be included in the regular budgeting process. On the situation in Gaza, it is clear UNRWA is a morally bankrupt institution beyond the point of redemption, and this has been so for years. That's why Congress has prohibited funding for UNRWA in 2025 by law. It is essential USAID accelerate the scale up of trusted implementers without ties to terrorism to replace UNRWA in the West Bank and Gaza. We can't keep wasting time burying our heads in the sand, hoping UNRWA will magically change. It won't, it hasn't. You've got to move faster on getting hooked up with our trusted implementers in the region. Turning to Afghanistan, the Taliban have erased the rights of women and girls. It's imperative we keep educational opportunities open, including through distance learning models for vulnerable Afghan women and girls. I understand the American University of Afghanistan is prepared to scale up to meet the need and will be interested in your thoughts on this matter. In Syria, both state and USAID continue to pour funds into early recovery and stabilization activities, including in regime held areas. There's a lot of us that are greatly opposed to this. This is unacceptable and is opening doors for some of our Gulf partners to embrace the regime, again, which we oppose. We must ensure all U.S. activities are compliant with Caesar sanctions and continue to isolate this regime. I look forward to Senate movement on the Assad Anti-Normalization Act at its first opportunity. Finally, in Africa, there are critical issues that require USAID's immediate collaboration and partnership with African nations and organizations. These include deteriorating democracies, more military coups and authoritarian rule, unprecedented humanitarian emergencies, and escalating insecurities that drive armed conflict, terrorism, unparalleled levels of displacement. I think all of us are disappointed with the direction that the continent is going. Not only are these issues causing widespread suffering and instability, but importantly, they harm our national interest. The President's budget needs to adequately resource USAID and other agencies to help address these critical issues. It's regrettable the budget request again lacks discipline. If the administration cannot prioritize, Congress will have to do it. USAID, are in a better position to prioritize, but it requires very, very tough choices. We know that. I get it. That someone has to do it, and it really should be you, not us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. Ambassador Power, you may proceed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Risch, and thanks for all the collaboration that we have with you, your teams, and the committee. It's absolutely invaluable. It really feels like whatever our differences that we are on the same team, on Team America, in a really, really difficult set of circumstances in the world. I just want to start with a reflection on something that right now is sitting in the lobby of the Republic of Korea's Development Agency, which is their equivalent of USAID. In the lobby, they have chosen to display an old bag of flour from the 1940s, which is marked with the words, "From the American people." And this is a reminder of how the United States supported them when they were one of the poorest countries on the planet, to help them fight hunger and disease and to kickstart the remarkable journey toward the kind of economic growth that we see today. South Korea is today one of the world's richest nations. And last year, and this should be really heartening to everyone, it spent nearly $4 billion providing aid to other nations. This year, the Republic of Korea plans to spend nearly $5 billion. That's a 30% increase. The decades that the United States has supported countries in charting their own paths of development have, in fact, brought extraordinary results for our partners and for our own people. We have helped stop the spread of diseases that threaten us all. We have helped develop more resilient, high-yield crops that can feed growing populations. Some of this innovation also shows up on American farms subsequently. We've helped people and nations rise from poverty, and in doing so, we have invested billions in U.S. small businesses, and we've opened up new markets for American products. 8 of America's top 10 trading partners were once recipients of U.S. assistance. Under President Biden's leadership and in partnership with this committee, we are building on that remarkable legacy. In Ukraine, USAID has helped farmers withstand Putin's attempts to destroy the agricultural sector. We have gotten farmers the seeds, equipment, and worked with the European Union and the Ukrainians to get them the alternative export routes, particularly when the Black Sea was almost entirely out of commission, the alternative export routes that they needed. The results of this are actually staggering, and I feel in light of the debate, particularly in the need to get the supplemental across the finish line, the Senate supplemental passed in the House, it is really worth noting that Ukraine's grain exports now are very near their pre-war export levels. That is remarkable. It is a tribute above all to the courage and the ingenuity of Ukrainians, but it is also a tribute to the decisions made up here to provide USAID with the resources to support the agricultural sector, to crowd in the private sector, and to get farmers planting, harvesting, and exporting again. Global food prices, of course, are related to what happens in Ukraine on those farms. They are now down 26% from their 2022 peak. And again, that comes from work on the ground, helping Ukrainians do what they had every intention of doing before Putin began brutalizing their people and their economy. In Nigeria, we're providing community health workers with technologies to spot diseases like tuberculosis early, which helped increase TB diagnoses by 1/3 in a single year, so that patients can get treatment and outbreaks don't spread across the planet. Across Africa, we are working to connect African and American companies and reduce barriers to trade through the Prosper Africa initiative, efforts that since 2019 have generated some $86 billion in trade and investment, and that is work that builds prosperity for both our African partners and, again, for businesses here at home. Bipartisan support for these efforts makes Americans safer and more prosperous and provides a critical foundation for American influence and leadership in a world where other global powers are working aggressively to erode U.S. alliances, to undermine democracy, and to diminish basic rights and freedoms. For example, the PRC's global lending spree has made it now, and this is really bears repeating, the world's largest debt collector. That is what the PRC has become. For every dollar of assistance it provides to low-income and middle-income countries, the PRC has provided around $9 in debt. So $1 in grant for every $9 in debt. The opposite is true of the United States. For every dollar of debt that we provide at least $9 of assistance. The PRC's assistance tends to be negotiated behind closed doors, fueling corruption, and it can demonstrate a flagrant disregard for human rights. Many of you are familiar with the PRC's Safe Cities initiative, whereby they have provided surveillance and facial recognition technology that can monitor critics, journalists, and activists. That technology provided so far to at least 80 countries. We need American leadership to advance models of development and governance that honor freedom, transparency, and dignity, as well as economic opportunity for all. The Biden-Harris administration's FY 2025 request of $28.3 billion for USAID's fully and partially managed accounts would give us the resources to continue that leadership. With these funds, we will help nations around the world strengthen food security, improve health, and this is a particular area of emphasis for us, particularly coming out of the COVID, is driving economic growth. We will respond as well to historic levels of humanitarian need. USAID teams have been working day and night to address the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where nearly the entire population is living under the threat of famine. Add to that the ongoing crises in Ukraine, Sudan, and beyond, and continued battering from a growing number of natural disasters, and the number of people requiring humanitarian assistance, and this is really a staggering statistic, has increased by nearly 1/3 from 274 million in 2022 to 363 million at the end of 2023. That is, I don't know that there's ever been a time in history where you've seen that amount of growth in under 2 years, in basically just over a year. To meet these needs, we will need both the $10 billion in this budget as well as the $10 billion in emergency humanitarian assistance in the pending National Security Supplemental Request. Otherwise, we are going to have to make draconian cuts to rations all around the world. The FY 2025 request recognizes the need for trade-offs, and it's a very, very important point. We really do embrace that reality. Crucially, this budget gives us specific resources to help us deliver better results and better value for money. We've worked really closely with your teams, inaugurating our new Office of the Chief Economist last July, growing that team. That team is helping us expand the use of rigorous data analysis across the agency to identify the programs with the highest impact per dollar invested so that those programs can be scaled. I'll give you one brief example. They identified a poverty reduction program our Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance has piloted in Uganda, and this is a program that offers a sequenced set of supports like training and financial services that help refugees move from requiring humanitarian assistance to earning sustainable livelihoods of their own. We want to do much more of this around the world, and we have to because of the chronic refugee populations. For every dollar that we invest, households are seeing over 4 times the return in economic benefits in that program. And so now we are expanding it to other nations. Beyond maximizing our own resources, we are drawing in new partners through tools like our EDGE Fund. And thanks to this Congress for resourcing the EDGE Fund. Again, we'd like to see those resources grow over time, but this is exactly what we need to be doing at a time where the private sector has to drive a lot of development and where we have to leverage any resources you give us and turn it into more. So the EDGE Fund is an incentive fund that basically applies the private sector's unique comparative advantages to some of the world's largest development challenges. We're working with companies like Citibank, Walmart, Johnson & Johnson to boost our impact and drive progress beyond our narrow programs. From FY21 to FY 2023 alone, and this is really something that has mattered a great deal to us, and I hope a great deal to you, private sector partner contributions to USAID activities jumped by more than 60%. And that's the trajectory that we need to remain on. We need to keep investing in order to do so in a workforce that is nimble, able to embrace private sector partnerships, trained accordingly, and empowered to pursue catalytic change, to view USAID as a hustler and a broker also of other development investments. If we do make these investments in our workforce, and thanks for the support for our operational expenses, I have no doubt that we can continue America's extraordinary legacy of leadership in building a more stable and prosperous world for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, but more importantly, thank you very much for your service. I just really want to first underline the point you made about PRC China and their debt diplomacy and debt traps, I would say, to other countries. It points out how we have to strengthen our own tools in order to deal with that issues, but also we need to do a better job in public relations and explaining the difference between partnerships with the United States and partnerships with the People's Republic of China. Because, as you point out, we leverage so that the country can control its fate. The PRC leverages so that China can control their fate. And that point, I think, needs to be underscored a lot more than we have in the past. I'll just point that out. We are here to talk about the FY25 budget, but we have to first talk about the FY24 budget. You made reference to the importance of the supplemental appropriation bill that passed the United States Senate that's now in the House of Representatives. We've had a lot of discussions in the press and publicly about the importance to Ukraine and their military defense against Putin's aggression. We've had conversations here about the aid in the Middle East to Israel in regards to Hamas's attack against Israel. We've had discussions here about the importance in the Indo-Pacific area against PRC's aggression, particularly as it relates to Taiwan. We need to concentrate today on the importance in regards to our humanitarian needs and your ability to carry out your mission for the remainder of this year and into next fiscal year. So I want to concentrate in 3 areas. We have a humanitarian crisis in Sudan. I mentioned that. Senator Booker was just recently in the country and told many of us about just the dire needs that are there. We see every day the challenges in Gaza. We know we have to do more on the humanitarian front, and that requires U.S. leadership and U.S. dollars. And we know that in Ukraine we have a humanitarian crisis because of the war. So tell us how important it is to pass the funds that are in the supplemental. We passed the FY24 budget. Is that enough to deal with these concerns, or do you need the supplemental, and how critically important is the supplemental to deal with those incredibly challenging crises that we see every day?
Thank you. I know we don't have a lot of time, but this is such an important question. So let me first start by saying that the word supplemental for the countries and the crises that you mentioned is in many ways a misnomer. Why is that? Because a lot of the resources, and Senator Risch alluded to some of this, maybe in a different way, but a lot of the resources that we had previously channeled through the regular budget were moved in previous years to the supplemental. So if the National Security Supplemental were not to pass, or were not to pass at the current level that was sent over by the Senate, you would basically be seeing, in terms of humanitarian needs, including in Gaza, Sudan, and Ukraine, the three places you mentioned, you would be seeing in this year an increase of roughly 40% in humanitarian need and a decrease roughly of between 35 and 40% of humanitarian funding. So, and that is because, again, we were generously funded in the past. We were able to lead in response to crises as the numbers of people displaced and in dire need of food to survive increased because Congress stepped up, but stepped up also by moving resources that had been in the base to the supplemental. On Ukraine, without the supplemental, we actually have no resources to do the kind of energy, agriculture, anti-corruption work, the core development work that everybody up here, I think, supports us doing, but many assume that we have resources to do under the regular budget. So this just gets to sort of how the budget was organized, but it also gets, of course, to the indispensability of these needs. So on Sudan, on Gaza, on Ukraine, as Putin pulverizes communities, as he again tries to weaponize winter and take out energy infrastructure with really an unprecedented spate of attacks just in recent weeks, it's just heartbreaking that resources that Ukrainians need on the ground to be able to repair that energy infrastructure, for us to procure far enough in advance also so we can look ahead to next winter, because we know he's going to pursue the same approach if the war is not over by then, that those resources would be so close to passage in principle, and yet where a vote can't even be taken that is on the package that reflects a bipartisan majority here in the Senate the human consequences can't be overstated.
I'll just make one last point on this. We all know we need to do more in all three of the areas that I mentioned. We see that every day. More has to be done. The United States has been the leader in providing the resources for these humanitarian responses. If the United States does not provide the expected leadership in providing resources, what happens with the global community's response to these humanitarian needs?
Well, as you know, in Ukraine, for every dollar that the U.S. has provided, other donors have provided $2. As we have been stalled on our ability to provide direct budget support to the government of Ukraine, as Putin seeks to destroy its economy and destroy its ability to finance health, education, and other things, we have asked our partners to front load their funding and to step up. They have done so with a calculated view on the basis of recent history over the last 2 years that America will show up, that we can't abandon freedom and we can't leave Ukraine to be the victim of aggression at a time like this. There is absolutely no guarantee that we would be able to continue to leverage our leadership if we are not exercising it sufficiently. And that is what is at stake here. And Ukraine is just one example.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the couple of things you said are really impressive. That Korea story is something that needs to be repeated again and again in America. We always beat ourselves up and don't talk about the successes. That's a tremendous success, and it's kind of lost in the fog of stuff that goes on here. But to be able to say that not only did we do that, and admittedly we spent a lot of blood and a lot of treasure getting there, but not only did we do that, but the fact that the Koreans recognize that we did that and give credit to the United States for doing that is really an impressive fact. The second one that struck me in the comments that you made was the comparison of what we do compared to what China does. And your characterization of China as being the largest debt collector in the world, I'd never heard before, but is obviously true because of the tremendous amount of debt that they've got out there and that they're collecting, in many cases from, like a loan shark, collecting it from people that can't afford to pay it. And as the chairman pointed out, they use that, China uses that, to actually bolster their national security by controlling what happens in another country, which is 180 from what we do. So I think both of those points you made are really, really good points and really need to be underscored for all of us in the United States when we get to feeling badly about how things are degrading, and they are degrading in a lot of places, as we know. I do want to talk about a couple of things that you and I have talked about before, and that is, look, for years, I've been saying we need to put UNRWA out of business. And we defunded them, as you know, in the 2025 budget. And I got to tell you, that is the majority view in Congress. I understand there's others that think that UNRWA is, somehow there's some good parts of UNRWA. If there are, I haven't seen them yet. It's going to be really important because I really believe Congress is going to continue down that line. Now, the things that UNRWA does, that we have them do, we pay them to do, or provide the resource for them to do, are really important. They need to be done. The best example of that's in Jordan. What UNRWA does in Jordan is, with our money, is absolutely imperative with the millions of refugees they have there. The Jordanian government can't stand without that. So tell me about your efforts in that regard to identify other implementers. And I assume it's a begrudging transfer to other implementers. Tell me what you're doing. Give me some hope here.
Well, first of all, thank you for recognizing a couple of points that I made in my opening comments, and I agree with also your implied point, which is that our communications game lags behind the facts. And that's a challenge that all of us are facing in an environment of misinformation and a very cluttered media environment. But it is just so important. I think notwithstanding that point, which is a very good one, it's interesting to see the polling and the turn in public opinion as it relates to PRC lending and investment. It's also noteworthy that the PRC, in part because they are the debt collector, and a lot of the debts are not able to be collected because the interest rates were so high or because of COVID or for whatever reason, they're also pulling back a lot. If you look at Belt and Road investments, they're way, way down over the last few years, creating a huge opening for America's model of development. To UNRWA, I think to answer your question, first of all, USAID doesn't fund UNRWA, the State Department does, but we're one U.S. government trying to mobilize a humanitarian response. USAID partners like World Food Program, UNICEF, Save the Children, International Medical Corps are our implementing partners. They are the ones out there, of course, seeking to get convoys in to reach people who are facing desperate conditions. They do rely, as you well know, on the humanitarian infrastructure, and there is no ready substitute. And I think even maybe just pivoting to Jordan for a second, we can come back to Gaza, but it's not like another international organization or another NGO in the sense that it is the school system for refugees in Jordan, who, as you know, I think it's 2 million kids are cared for by UNRWA-run schools. So you're talking not about what international organizations or NGOs normally, it's not like there's, hundreds of thousands of teachers from elsewhere who are, on standby waiting to get the call. It's an extremely complex question, but as you note, this is something that the Jordanian government does not have the fiscal space or the human capacity to take on. And so right now, other donors, notwithstanding the deeply alarming allegations and the investigations that are underway, Most of them have resumed funding because of the indispensability of the services and because of the view that, notwithstanding, again, very, very problematic allegations against specific individuals in Gaza, that those allegations do not extend across UNRWA, funding across the region. So right now, the UNRWA infrastructure is still being relied upon, including by USAID's partners. I would note that the government of Israel, even, a month or two ago, or a month ago, said UNRWA cannot be involved in convoys inside Gaza because of course, the allegation, the infiltration with those individuals potentially. And they have had to change that position because there is no way to deliver food to prevent famine, further famine, without UNRWA at the heart of the response. So now UNRWA is able to be not leading convoys, but part of convoys, in terms of how the government of Israel is engaging with that question. That is not, I'm not pretending that the government of Israel is embracing UNRWA, but I'm making a point more about necessity and the indispensability of meeting the humanitarian imperative.
Well, thanks for that. I got to tell you, I understand all the arguments, but look, if UNRWA's in, I'm out, period. I understand the arguments that, oh, they got to be there, blah, blah, blah. Look, you've seen the text like I've seen the text. It's U.S. taxpayer money teaching these young kids, these young Palestinian kids, how to be a terrorist, and not only how to be a terrorist, but that it's their obligation under the religious practices and everything else. It's just sickening, to be honest with you. Then, of course, this thing that happened on October 7th, where they actually had members of UNRWA included in the attack on Israel. We got to go a different direction. So if UNRWA can't do it, too bad. I'm out. But I've had it with UNRWA, and I think a lot of my colleagues are in the same position. But in any event, my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez.
Madam Administrator, it's fair to say from your testimony that if you do not get the $10 billion in the supplemental, that you will not be able to meet your humanitarian mission across the globe as it's presently challenged.
Yes, that's true.
Which means that every day that House Republicans wait, people die.
There are going to be catastrophic humanitarian effects to not bringing more resources to bear, for sure.
They'll die on the battlefield in Ukraine, and they'll die of hunger in various parts of the world. And so this is not a esoteric exercise. In a bipartisan way, the Senate sent a package that would meet not only Ukraine's needs, meet our challenge in the Indo-Pacific, but at the same time, meet our humanitarian challenge and obligation in the world and the ability to leverage other countries. And so people are dying. They're dying on the battlefield. They're dying of hunger. And for some reason, House Republicans cannot put a simple vote on the floor. And it's pretty outrageous. How will you get assistance, assuming you get the money, into Gaza? I just heard your whole conversation with Senator Risch. Succinctly, please, because I know you have a professorial way about you from your history, but can you, since I have limited time, how will you be able to get assistance into Gaza?
Well, the gating issue up to this point, because we're drawing on the resources that we do have, because we're where we are in the fiscal year, we still have resources. But the gating issue has not yet been resources, it has been access. It has been the restrictions on
So if the
moving.
gating systems are resolved, if the access is resolved, you will
No,
have
no,
the
the
wherewithal?
access is not
I said,
resolved.
if the access is resolved, you will have the wherewithal to get what aid?
Well, for a certain period of time, but I mean, there are 20,000 metric tons of flour sitting in Ashdod port right now that we have been trying to get out. That's 1,000 trucks worth of flour, and that hasn't been resolved. There have been important steps, I think, taken in the last few days, and indeed, I think we have more than 400 trucks got into Gaza today, which is the second time we've been able to cross the 400 truck number. So things have improved a bit, and of course, we're trying to get food in through multiple entrance points, including hoping that the government of Israel moves very quickly to open the Erez crossing. But there's still really profound access issues.
Okay. Let me move to something else. last year, I published something I called the Menendez Plan, which is a framework that would address the cycle of mass migration at the southwestern border of the United States through the development of a sustainable and structural response to migration in the region. I think all of our immigration challenges that we have at the southern border deny one fact, that there are 25 million people in the southern hemisphere presently displaced from their country of origin, refugees seeking asylum or just being displaced. Right now, they're in other countries within the hemisphere. Unless we work with those countries to assimilate those individuals, I don't care what we do at the border, but we will have 25 million feet marching northwards. So part of what I outlined is an effort to expand humanitarian assistance and development of financing to better integrate migrants and refugees in those countries across the Americas. Capacity building, economic resilience are paramount to that. Can you tell me some specifics on how you'll utilize the funds requested in FY25 to address those root causes of migration and to help those countries assimilate individuals so they're not marching northward?
Well, first, this is one of these points that doesn't get made enough, which is just how countries who are on the path for migrants, and we are very focused on those who come to our border, understandably, but countries like Colombia, Brazil, Peru, just how many, for example, Venezuelans have landed on their doorsteps. They have maintained open borders. There have been regularization or integration rules put on the books in countries like Colombia that have been incredibly important, allowing kids to go to school, get health benefits, and the like. And there are already now proven economic benefits. A huge number of businesses in Colombia created by Venezuelans who have migrated. That's
what they've done. What will we do to help them?
USAID is doing a huge amount. For example, in Peru, we created a program to support the government in accrediting professional degrees of migrants who have arrived so that they can come and work as doctors. In Colombia, those programs in the border region and the migrant centers for regularization, those are ones that have been supported with USAID funding. But a lot of these programs, they have closed their registration eligibility, or they've closed down registration. So we are also working through development diplomacy to try to urge those governments to reopen registration, because the vast majority of people who come to this country are those who have been unable to access the regularization.
Could I ask you to have someone from your agency come and sit with our office to discuss what you intend to do, because we have some ideas about how we achieve those goals. And finally, if I may, Mr. Chairman, in 2023, Azerbaijan launched a military assault on the Artsakh region. It caused 120,000 Armenians to be ethnically cleansed from what was known as their homeland. You activated a disaster assistance response team. You've approximately given $15.6 million to Armenia to address this. This is $130 per displaced person. It just doesn't work. Do you have intentions of doing more?
Yes, I was just meeting with the Armenian Prime Minister, in Brussels, along with the European Union and Secretary Blinken on Friday. And we announced a number of new initiatives there, including work with the Armenian government and financial support as they attempt to provide permanent housing to those people from Nagorno-Karabakh who have come and have just been in stopgap housing since last year. As you know, I was at the border trying to greet those desperate families who had been forced from their homes, and this is something of personal importance to me, as is supporting the Armenian government in their reform efforts, because fundamentally their ability to use also their own resources to cater to that population, to integrate that population for those who are not able to go home, will turn on them continuing to grow their economy, which they have been doing at a fierce clip over the last 2 years.
If you could have somebody, when you send me somebody on the other who can address this issue too, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Senator Paul.
Ms. Powers, on April 26, 2023, you testified before this committee that USAID did not fund gain-of-function research. I'd like to give you a chance to correct the record. Is it still your position that USAID did not fund gain-of-function research?
We have no evidence that USAID has funded gain-of-function research, and we certainly haven't authorized gain-of-function research.
Well, I'll help you. Behind me, we'll list a paper from 2015. This is a paper produced by the Wuhan Institute of Virology and also by Dr. Barrick from UNC. In this paper, if you'll see the funding aspect that's highlighted, it says USAID EPT predict funding from EcoHealth Alliance. So this paper was one where they took a virus, the SARS virus, the backbone of the SARS virus, and then took an S protein from an unknown virus they found in the wild and put them together. Are you aware that these experiments in the study were supported by USAID Predict and Grant through EcoHealth Alliance?
As I said, USAID has not authorized gain-of-function research. This is the first time seeing this. We're happy to look into it.
This has been around since 2015. We've been over it numerous times. It's been in the public record. We've repeatedly said that, yes, USAID did fund gain-of-function research. Here's the evidence. But here's some comments from some different people about this study, because some will try to argue this still is not gain-of-function. Simon Wayne Hobson is a virologist at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. He points out that the researchers have created, with this research funded by USAID, a novel virus that grows remarkably well in human cells. If the virus escaped, nobody could predict the trajectory. Richard Ebright from Rutgers says, the only impact of this work is the creation in a lab of a new, non-natural risk to humanity. So is your position that this study was not gain-of-function or that you didn't fund it? Which is your position?
We have had an awful lot of back and forth and provided thousands of pages of documents on this. This article, it looks like it's from 2015.
Right.
So we will have to look into the specific claims. But again, to put on the record,
It's a big
USAID
point.
has not
But
and
actually,
will not
that is your
authorize
position.
gain-of-function
I
research.
know that's your position, but the record will show that you did.
Well-
And this was before your time. I don't know why we can't just admit it. It did happen. And the reason this is important is many people want to collect all these viruses from around the world, but they don't want to just collect the viruses to sort of have them and have a library of viruses. They take the virus, then they take an S protein from another virus, and they create a virus that doesn't exist in nature that often has ramifications that could be quite different or quite serious. I'll give you the words of the authors of this paper. On the basis of these findings, scientific review panels may deem similar studies building chimeric viruses based on circulating strains too risky to pursue. So this was funded by USAID. It was funded through the PREDICT program. There's no question of that. And even the authors admit that it was gain of function. So we have to get beyond sort of quibbling over whether it was, because we have to make sure in the future we're not doing this and that we don't fund this going forward. Now, the PREDICT program was going to be surpassed by another program going after viruses, and that has been suspended. That is all good. But we have to admit the past, be truthful about the past in order to go forward, because millions of people died from COVID-19. The FBI has concluded it came from a lab in Wuhan. The Department of Energy has concluded that. Even the CIA initially, their scientific board, voted 6-1 until they were overturned by higher-ups at the CIA to say otherwise. They voted to say that this thing came from the lab as well. It only comes from the lab if we're in favor of creating these things. We can't control everything China does, but we certainly shouldn't be funding it. So we have to be honest that this was funded. Now, there was a warning sign to us that this was going on. There was something called the Diffuse Project in 2018 that was presented to DARPA, once again by Barrick and by Dr. Shi in Wuhan.
That's okay.
The Diffuse Project was to create a coronavirus with a furin cleavage site, which doesn't exist in nature but makes it incredibly more infectious in humans. There was a briefing to 15 agencies. One of the agencies was USAID. There was a briefing about this Diffuse Project. But nobody from USAID and nobody from all 15 agencies ever told anyone about this project. It was hidden for years and years and only revealed by a brave Lieutenant Colonel Marine working at DARPA who exposed this when everybody else had hidden this. And my question is, USAID was in this briefing about a research project that had incredible danger to our country and finally wasn't funded. Will you provide the names of the people from USAID who were in this meeting so they can be interviewed so we can find out why didn't they tell anyone, or did they tell their superiors and people ignored them? Why was the public never made aware that they were trying to do dangerous research to create a virus very similar to what COVID-19 became? And how could 15 agencies show up for a briefing and no one expose it to the public, and we only hear about it by a whistleblower? Will you provide for us the name of the person at the USAID who attended this briefing in 2018 and let us interview them to find out what happened? Why was this never revealed to the public?
So I think within the 10,000 pages of documents you have from USAID are whatever documents we have on this DARPA proposers meeting. I received the letter, we received the letter from your staff yesterday. We'll certainly look at the request. But just to give a little context, U.S. government agencies often, on good days, show up for one another, go to each other's meetings. This is not something that USAID ever considered funding or was ever engaged on in some substantive way.
But the point is that after hearing that somebody wanted to put a furin cleavage site in the virus, alarm bells go off. And then when you see the virus in 2020 and you say, oh my goodness, they did what they were asking, someone should have said, wow, I was in that hearing and I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now I'm like, maybe I should tell somebody, maybe I should call up the president, maybe I should call up Anthony Fauci, maybe somebody should be informed that we learned about this and I didn't think anything of it at the time. You're right, it could have been inconsequential in 2018. In 2020, it becomes profoundly important. Why didn't anybody from government come forward and warn us that this could be a virus not from nature, which is not very infectious usually, and was incredibly infectious because it had been pre-adapted in a lab for human transmission?
Look, I just want to come back to your earlier point. All of this ended at USAID in 2020. It is before my time. We don't feel defensive about these engagements. We've appreciated
That's all we're asking for is we'd like to interview the person who was at that meeting.
I understand. We will look at that request, but what I just want to make clear is that in a collaborative spirit, we also understand the stakes, the human stakes, of history, of recent history, and the risks. And you have raised flags in a manner that has required us to dig in, I think, in important ways on top of what we had been doing previously. And so we will continue the back and forth with you and your office, and certainly don't ever want to be in a position to do anything ourselves using taxpayer resources to create risks.
Thank you, and I do appreciate the cooperation that your agency has given us.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Administrator, for being here today and for the work that you do every day on behalf not just of the United States, but of so many people around the world. I appreciated your opening story about the Republic of Korea and the bag of flour, because I just got back from the Indo-Pacific during break where we visited the Republic of Korea. We had a chance to personally thank them for their support for what's happening in Ukraine, the effort to fight back against the autocratic and horrendous behavior of Vladimir Putin and the Russians in Ukraine. And you talked, we also heard that they are following very closely, not just in the Republic of Korea, but in Japan and the Philippines and in Vietnam, where we also visited, what's happening with the supplemental, because it does affect what happens in the Indo-Pacific. And it does affect how the PRC views the United States and our willingness to stick with our allies. And you mentioned, I think, very clearly the importance of passing the supplemental. And you talked about what it would mean for humanitarian efforts in Gaza, but you didn't talk about some of the other places around the world where they are also depending on the passage of that supplemental. Can you talk about a couple of the other areas that you're very concerned about, that and what will happen if the supplemental is not passed by the House?
Well, we had an exchange with Senator Menendez about migration. Venezuelan refugees. I mean, such a huge share of the population has tumbled into neighboring countries, leaving everything behind. Those countries, as I mentioned, have been very generous, but those countries also depend on the humanitarian assistance that agencies like the World Food Program, UNICEF, and others provide. It's asking double if you both ask for integration and then ask for all humanitarian needs to be borne by the communities and the countries in which those migrants land. So it would be horrific if we had to cut rations or support to agencies supporting Venezuelan refugees. Second, Sudan. A number of people rightly have mentioned Sudan. I'm looking forward to hearing from Senator Booker about his trip. But you know, we have been privileged to be able to provide over the last year close to $1 billion in support. That privilege, of course, is the perverse consequence of two military men who are destroying their country and leaving their people who were able to provide largely for themselves, except in core conflict areas like Darfur over the last decades, but has left those people almost entirely in certain communities dependent on humanitarian aid.
Thank you very much. I think it's safe to say, as Senator Menendez did so directly, and you acknowledged, that millions of lives are on the line here. And if this supplemental package does not get passed by the House, people are going to die. They're going to die in Ukraine, they're going to die in South America, they're going to die in Africa, and they're going to die all over the world. And I hope that those people who are holding up that package in the House understand what's at stake. I want to switch to another part of Europe. I was very concerned by last week's news that the Georgian Parliament reintroduced the Foreign Agents Law, which would tighten restrictions on civil society. That's similar to what Russia has passed. Can you talk about what the consequences would be for U.S.-funded civil society organizations if that Foreign Agents Law is passed in Georgia?
Well, we have seen the cut and paste version of the Russia Foreign Agents Bill pop up in multiple places, and the effects are less accountability for corruption, a chilling effect on speech. Certainly, Georgia, which is now on a path, or seeks to be on a path to Europe, and has gotten some recognition of late and an embrace of that ambition. You know, fundamentally, a foreign agents law like that has no place in Europe. The human rights and democratic principles need to be not only respected but also protected.
Well, thank you. I hope that the government of Georgia will decide to support what the people of Georgia want, which is the move towards Europe and the rights that come with a democracy, a full democracy. And I'm out of time, but I want to make just one more point about the trip that we took to the Indo-Pacific, because one of the things I was very interested in was hearing from President Marcos in the Philippines, from the officials we met in Vietnam, the concern about climate change and the impact of climate change on the countries in the Indo-Pacific. President Marcos told us that the Philippines is the most threatened country because of climate change, and they talked about the importance of the U.S. leadership on that issue. So I'm out of time, as I said, but I hope that you will continue to support our efforts to lead on climate change. Thank you.
But maybe just one point in response, which is one of the investments that we have made that we are probably most proud of at the agency, particularly our humanitarians, is in the Philippines' disaster response capabilities. And you know, if you just go back 10 years even and look at how much, for example, the Defense Department, USAID, and other outside partners were doing in order to support humanitarian response, and now look at the extent to which the Philippines has built out its own capabilities in a really impressive way, including a civ-mil partnership between the civilian agencies and the military. It's really impressive. Thank you.
Senator Shaheen, I appreciate you mentioning the Georgia efforts to adopt a Russian-style, Putin-style foreign agent. We've been very supportive of Georgia's integration into Europe, into moving in the right path. This is certainly moving in the wrong path. and we have put them on notice. I've contacted their ambassador to let them know of our concerns that this really could affect Georgia's movement into integration to Europe. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Senator Menendez indicated, I am sometimes overwhelmed by the degree of starvation, the migration as associated with climate change, and the problems in the world are so enormous. How do you decide where to intervene and where to spend the money? How do you prioritize all the things? I mean, because we don't have enough money to get everybody out of poverty, to solve all the hunger problems in the world, to solve all the migration problems in the world, to solve all the awful things that are going on in the world. We're not there. There was a time when the U.S. economy was like half that of the world. Today, it's like 15%. So we simply can't do everything we'd like to do. How do you decide where to spend the resources? What is your priority for tackling their various challenges?
Thank you, and I don't have time, I think, to do justice to the full sort of way that we do prioritization. We are also 90% earmarked, so some of that prioritization is taken out of our hands, but it's only really by sector, so your question is still very valid in terms of what we do. You know, even if we have X amount for malaria and X amount for TB, where do you do it? And there, I think, governance and where that dollar is likely to go further matters a great deal, particularly if we're working with state and local government. USAID has just last year launched an Office of the Chief Economist to actually bring, we've done measurement, evaluation, learning about particular programs for a long time, but we're now bringing a best buy mindset, literally doing cost effectiveness studies, randomized control trials. For example, a programmatic intervention where we hire a contractor or give a grant to an organization, how does that compare against giving cash in a particular community? And seeing, there's some studies that show that through cash benchmarking that actually giving just small amounts of cash allows, for example, somebody to start a business or get the access to capital that they need locally. So we want to make sure we do a cost effectiveness filter through the work that we do everywhere. We, of course, look at the nexus with U.S. security, pandemic prevention, lab surveillance, global health security. That's an example of investments that have really increased, although unfortunately are down in the 24 budget that was just passed. That's an investment in our lives. The same with our clean energy work. Of course, it's one thing to have the Inflation Reduction Act here and be lowering emissions over time, but we know that there are many big players like South Africa, Indonesia, countries in which we work where their emissions affect Americans just as much as ours do.
Yeah, I guess I actually would hope to have a more clear priority that yes, there has to be an enormous humanitarian need, but there also has to be a very clear U.S. interest in intervening in that particular area. And yeah, we don't want to waste money and so forth, and you mentioned those things, but there has to be some prioritization. My impression is that the Chinese, for instance, their economy is about the same size as ours, particularly if you look at purchase power parity. Their economy is larger than ours on that basis, but they're not spending anywhere near what we are in the world, other than to support Chinese interests. Hopefully, we will apply the same metric to decide where we're going to be spending our funding. Has there been work done at USAID to compare, here's what China does, and if there is, I'd love to see a report or if there's work like that that's around to say, here's how they do it. I know they do things with debt. They loan the money. We say, no, we don't do it with debt. We give them money, except we borrow the money from others to give the money away. Which is smarter, us borrowing to give it away or them just loaning it? And I think we may have something to learn from a country that says they're going to make those investments where there's humanitarian need and where it's in their national interest, and two, to do it in a way that's economically the most frugal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a fair point there, of course, around prioritization, but, the PRC does not is not, as you're noting, is not motivated by the humanitarian imperative that moves so many Americans. That the service impulse, the kind of compassion that we have shown, which
The challenge is that
no, I understand, but I'm just talking specifically about
the needs in the world are so enormous
I understand.
that when you look at those needs, you have to say, you know, we have more interest, for instance, in Haiti than we might in some place far, far away, in part because it's in our neighborhood. All right, so we're going to show priority there. We have interest in Ukraine because we know that the old Soviet Union did some really bad things that we fought for decades, and so we want to keep that from happening again. I mean, they're national interests that would strike me as being high in the priority. I know my time is up, so Mr. Chairman, I will stop. Ambassador Power, if there's something you want to say, fine, but I'll pull back.
Thank you. Just simply to say that I believe that filter is applied. I also believe that we play a long game, and had we been narrowly transactional in the way that the Chinese are 40 years ago, many of the countries that are now huge sources of huge markets for U.S. goods would not be markets for U.S. goods. Many of the diseases that have been prevented would not have been prevented had we just gone, again, in that what matters in the here and now and what is our national security matrix on this particular day or this particular year. So I think we have to have the right balance between absolutely looking for that nexus, making sure that our dollars go where they're intended, looking out for things that are happening in the hemisphere that have a direct bearing or things that relate to disease or the health of Americans for sure. But we're also, making investments now whose payoff may not be evident for some years in the future.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Administrator Power. Good to see you for the second day in a row, and thanks again to you and your entire AID team for what you do for our country around the world. I have some questions on Gaza and some on Sudan, two areas where we're experiencing humanitarian crises. First on Gaza, I'm glad people are still at the table in Cairo on a ceasefire and release the hostages deal. It's essential that the world put pressure on Hamas to accept the deal that's on the table. In the meantime, we also need to address, as we discussed yesterday, the humanitarian crisis being experienced by over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. Yesterday, I asked you what changes the President and the Biden administration want to see from the Netanyahu government's approach to the war in Gaza. And you mentioned the need to lift unnecessary restrictions on humanitarian aid, and you mentioned the need to maximize civilian protection. As you know, under the National Security Memorandum number 20, signed by the President, the administration must submit a report to Congress by May 8th, and that report must determine whether Israel, Ukraine, and other countries using U.S. weapons in conflicts now have over the last 14 months been sufficiently facilitating the delivery of humanitarian assistance, whether they've been complying with international law, and whether they're using best practices to reduce civilian harm. In that regard, I want to know whether you've seen a very troubling article written by an Israeli investigative reporter about the Netanyahu's government use of artificial intelligence systems for targeting in Gaza. One called Lavender, the other called Where's Daddy? Have you seen that investigative report?
I have not, Senator.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the report be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. So, look, if this report is true, it has very troubling implications regarding targeting issues, the kind of issues we discussed yesterday. So I ask two things. One is if you will read it, I've got a copy here, and whether you will bring it to the attention of your colleagues at the State Department. Can I get your commitment to do that?
Yes.
Thank you. On Sudan, and I was there a number of years ago when there was hope that there'd be that transition to democracy. Obviously, we've seen a complete deterioration in the situation there. We have, you know, at least two warring parties, one of them headed by Hemedti, with the Rapid Support Forces. He, as you well recall, because you've written about these things, was part of the Janjaweed and the really genocide in Darfur years ago. Can you talk about what AID is doing to help displaced people in Sudan, specifically with respect to those who are coming across the Chad, the border with Chad?
I traveled last year back to Chad, all those years after the genocide in Darfur, when I was last there meeting with Sudanese who had been targeted by Hemedti's Janjaweed. And the conditions in Chad are very difficult for Chadians in that area. It's extremely remote, not a lot of access to water, really afflicted by climate change. So of the $1 billion nearly in humanitarian support, USAID, or the U.S. government, of which $600 million from USAID, has provided a significant share has gone to UN agencies and others working in Chad. I will say, though, that the Sudanese Armed Forces, General Burhan, has done something very problematic on top of all the other problematic things he and Hemedti have done, which is basically make it much more difficult for the UN to move those convoys across the border to people who haven't been able to make it to Chad. And so basically saying this is an international border, you know, we get to decide what crosses, fine, but decide that humanitarian aid should cross and reach your people. And he's authorized now one crossing point, but it's very remote and not nearly sufficient to meet the needs, because people in Darfur, again, many would like to get to Chad, but have no means of making the long journey and need food and resources where they are.
Well, thank you. I look forward to following up with you and your team on that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of my colleagues today have talked about the supplemental and the consequences of not getting the supplemental, saying people are going to die. I would remind all my colleagues, both the House and the Senate, that Americans are dying today of drug overdose. The leading cause of death of young Americans in this country today is drug overdose. The biggest part of that, fentanyl, 70,000. When I'm talking about young Americans, I'm talking 18 to 45, leading cause of death. Since the Biden administration's open border policy, in my state, Nebraska, we have seen the impact of this. When I was governor, law enforcement in 2019 took 46 pills laced with fentanyl off our streets. Just 2 years later, that number had skyrocketed to 151,000. 2021, 151,000. Through the first 2 years of the Biden administration, we saw the amount of methamphetamine in our state double, fentanyl triple, cocaine up by 10 times. So yes, we want to take care of people around the world. We need to take care of our people. And it is foolish, in my opinion, to think that we can pass these supplementals, additional aid, if we cannot get something done with our southern border. To switch topics, I want to build on what Ranking Member Risch was talking about with regard to UNRWA, because again, we see a huge problem here with an organization that, as the ranking member talked about, its textbooks preach hate and killing Jews. The schools were hiding weapons. We saw that the IDF discovered in February that Hamas had an intelligence hub right under UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza, which UNRWA denied knowing anything about. Like, you didn't hear the people digging? It seems incredulous to me that they could deny that. So given the problems that UNRWA's had, and not only has with this current attack by Hamas in Israel on October 7th, but previously under the Trump administration, they cut off funding to UNRWA because of similar type problems, so this is not a surprise. This is an ongoing problem. So, Administrator Power, my question to you is, there's an investigation going on. There's an independent panel, has a final report yet to be released, but its interim report found that UNRWA has mechanisms in place to ensure its neutrality, quote unquote. If those mechanisms are in place, why is this still a problem? And how confident are you in the efficiency or efficacy of these investigations and the UN's ability to properly and unbiasedly investigate itself?
Well, let me say there, and just again, USAID doesn't fund UNRWA, and so there are others in our government who are more versed in the investigation, the procedures, but there are the two investigations, one into the initial list of 12 to 15 individuals who were named in these horrific, despicable allegations, and then an outside investigation that I think is independent, and of which I think we have reason to think it is independent, looking at the policies and procedures of UNRWA that could have given rise to a situation whereby individuals who were plotting an attack and such horrors could be members of an international organization or employees of an international organization. So those are the two investigations. I think, the only thing I would say is that, as I said in one of the earlier exchanges, but maybe just to elaborate, is, UNRWA has the trucks, the staff, the infrastructure, and a large number of UNRWA employees are serving selflessly to try to address the famine conditions in certain parts of Gaza and the imminent famine conditions in other parts of Gaza. And so I think that is just the other imperative here that we are being very sensitive to. And again, USAID, the US government, we are going to follow US law. There should be no question about that. But it is hard to imagine how humanitarian needs can be met, even if access improves at the scale it needs to improve, without these workers, those who are not implicated in these allegations, being part of the solution. The other thing I would say is that, Hamas was the governing authority in Gaza prior to October 7th. I suppose we can have some hope. I'm not sure now we yet know the details of how this will transpire, but that if Hamas is dismantled, that the governing structure who would be involved in decisions, for example, around school textbooks and the like, that they would go in a fundamentally different direction. But at this point, that is a long ways off. And that's with regard to some of the things that caused the Trump administration to cut off funding in the past, like issues with textbooks.
Are there some recommended reforms that you would recommend to UNRWA? Can you think of things that maybe you've seen in your experience that UNRWA is not doing that they ought to be doing, or things that, given what's come to light with regard to what UNRWA employees have been doing with regard to perpetrating these horrible atrocities?
Again,
can you think of some reforms?
First thing I would say is that I would disaggregate UNRWA and look at UNRWA in Jordan, UNRWA in Lebanon, UNRWA in Syria, UNRWA in the West Bank, UNRWA in Gaza. Of course, there are procedures and policies across those different areas, but I think it's really important to understand, again, how completely unusual this is compared to other international organizations or NGOs. We don't have NGOs filled with teachers or doctors, but UNRWA has taken on a kind of quasi-state role in some of the places that I've mentioned. I think clearly the vetting, if you have members of Hamas who are, perpetrating or alleged to have perpetrated attacks or involvement in horrific terrorism of the kind that transpired on October 7th and lives on through the hostages that are still in custody, clearly that's something that they're going to want to think very differently about.
One of the UNRWA employees was involved in an attack on a kibbutz that killed 97 people and resulted in 26 being taken hostage. I mean, this is very, very serious stuff for the UNRWA people. So I'm noted I'm out of town, but thank you, Administrator Power.
Thank you, Senator.
Powell. Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Administrator Power. Good to see you. I want to stick with the discussion about Gaza. Mr. Chair, I'd like to enter into a record, an article from The Hill that was from Sunday, titled, "Cindy McCain Says Gaza on the Edge of Going Over the Cliff with Famine and Not Being Able to Recover." Cindy is the widow of our former Senate Foreign Relations colleague, John McCain, a dear friend. I know, Administrator Power, you work
Without
closely.
objection, it'll be included in the record.
Thank you. I know you work closely with the World Food Program, and you know Cindy McCain. Do you share that concern that she expressed just 3 days ago, that Gazans are on the verge of very serious risk of famine?
Yes, I mean, I think the report that was done, which drew on really the gold standard of how we measure these things, is very clear on this matter. And WHO is already reporting deaths related to conditions stemming from malnutrition. And to just put this in some context, because it's clear that the humanitarian circumstances weren't great in Gaza before October 7th, but before October 7th, there was almost no child malnutrition whatsoever, and now close to 1 in 3 in northern Gaza. And if you look at, the severe acute malnutrition where you measure with the circumference, access is very difficult for organizations that measure these things. But just from January to February, not taking account of the last 6 weeks, severe acute malnutrition doubled among under 5 kids. So we are, and Cindy, of course, our USAID's great collaborator, and her teams were very eager to get food in there, but also very specifically to address the under 5 needs, which require ready-to-use therapeutic food, so very specific, kind of assistance. And we're hopeful that some of the changes that have been made and are being contemplated but need to be made urgently by Israel will allow us to flow in resources to nip what is a famine fundamentally in the bud.
I asked Secretary Austin yesterday at an Armed Services Committee hearing whether growing famine or medical catastrophe in Gaza would escalate violence in the region, and he said absolutely it would. The activities of Hezbollah in the north, the activities of the Houthis in the Red Sea, the activities of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, possibly activities of Iran itself, will only escalate at a time when we need to be looking for de-escalation, a hostage deal, a ceasefire, de-escalation in the region. So we have a compelling interest, we, the United States, the world, Israel, Gaza, Palestine, to avert this widening humanitarian catastrophe. Israel, of course, must defend itself against any who would annihilate it, including Hamas, Hamas who carried out the attack, who celebrated it, who says they'll do it again. But this should not be a war against Gazans or Palestinians. It should be a war against Hamas. And one of the main bits of evidence about what is it is the access to humanitarian supplies, especially food and medicine. We were getting about 500 trucks a day of supplies into Gaza before October 7. It was in the single digits or dozens for months and months and months. It took too long to open the Kerem Shalom border crossing. I do applaud President Biden in his conversations last week with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Subsequently, Kerem Shalom has been opened wider in terms of more supplies in. There's been a commitment to open the Erez border crossing. And we see the pace picking up. Israel has restored water service into the north of Gaza. Israel has allowed bakeries to open again to provide, make bread and food for Gazans. The pace of the trucks per day exceeded 300 for the first time on Sunday and got near 500 on Monday. But it has taken way too long to get supplies to suffering Gazans. Gazans are suffering under Hamas. They're not all Hamas. And so I would just like to ask you, I know as USAID, you work with these NGOs, many of which were troubled, frightened, scared, backed off of their activities after the attack on the World Central Kitchen convoy. Talk to me about what USAID can do in your remit to provide more confidence that humanitarian aid can be delivered at scale.
Uh-oh, the poster board.
That's the next person.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just.
You gotta get through Senator
He makes
King
an
first.
entrance. Look, what I would say is that I traveled to the region last month, and the nature of my engagement kind of mirrors the way you've played back some of the progress that's been made lately, which is, saying to the IDF and to the Prime Minister and to the government, these things are going to be done. The situation is going to get so bad that these additional steps are going to be taken. Just take them, take them now. Hard as it is, you know, and understanding the domestic politics and public opinion after what Hamas did. And unfortunately, a lot of time has been lost. And the commitments are really welcome, but the commitments need to be executed, including an additional crossing into the north, not just the agreement to do it, but the actual crossing. And you're right that the number of trucks is up, and that's incredibly important. But I think we also need to give some context here, which is you're also right that 500 trucks were entering before October 7th, but you know, that was commercial, that was humanitarian. It wasn't as if every family was in need of humanitarian assistance. Now, every family, pretty much, I think, is in need of humanitarian assistance. And if you think of the destruction of anything that one had in their home, markets, granaries, arable land, the bulldozing of arable land, and what you described, which is how few trucks were getting in over such a long period of time, we just have so much catch-up to do. Apart from the fact that whole towns where people lived, you know, no longer exist in the way that they did, where more than half of the buildings have been destroyed or damaged or uninhabitable in some fashion. So this is just unlike any of the environments that I've worked in the past or our partners have worked in, where, you know, there's some kind of reliable place where people can either start to rebuild their lives or imagine that the war ends and they can return to the lives they had and begin to grow their land again. I mean, all of that is going to take so long. So it just underscores, again, the importance of passing the National Security Supplemental Request so we have the resources to help, but understanding that the access issues and the protection issues where humanitarians can actually do their work safely, that those are commitments that have been made are followed through on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yesterday.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Chair.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Power, welcome. You're here today asking the committee to authorize USAID to receive and spend American taxpayer money. In your prepared testimony, you noted that USAID teams have been working day and night to send some of those resources to the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. How much money has USAID sent to the Gaza Strip during the Biden administration?
I mean, just first let me say that the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, I think, is not, I think the IDF would disagree at this point that that's an accurate characterization. Who
was the elected leadership in Gaza?
No. That's, again.
That would be Hamas, right?
Correct, but would you say that Hamas is controlling the Gaza Strip now?
Well, thankfully, no, because the Israelis are killing terrorists and the Biden administration is doing everything they can to try to stop the Israelis from killing the Hamas terrorists. So my question, how much money has USAID sent to Gaza during the Biden Strip, during the Biden administration?
I have not tabulated year to year what the investments have been, but we, as you know, the previous administration cut off assistance to the West Bank and Gaza, so it took a year and a half for us to begin to
I think it is an exceptionally bad idea to give money to people who want to kill us. I just want to be clear. You're testifying today. You don't know how much American taxpayer money you've already spent in Gaza, but you want more.
You're asking the question in a specific way, and I'll get you the specific numbers. Related specifically to Gaza, our resources often go to grantees or contractors who are working in the West Bank and Gaza, so you're slicing it narrowly to Gaza. I just don't want to say something that's inaccurate.
Okay, well, let's try this from another direction. Since Hamas's October 7th attacks, the Biden administration has surged aid into the Gaza Strip. Now, you're not able to tell us how much.
No, that wasn't your question.
But, well, okay, if you can tell us how much since October 7th, well, I'll take that too.
Okay, we I think, have announced between USAID and the State Department somewhere around $100 million, but that money has not necessarily moved into Gaza, if you know what I mean. I mean, this is to get money into the pipeline in order to get.
So how much has moved into Gaza since October 7th?
I can't say.
Well, there are UN and American government databases that list some of the aid. When you take a look at the databases for 2023 and 2024, you find about $40 million in grants to NGOs and UN agencies that are marked confidential. And you also find that millions of dollars of that aid was actually cash. Which NGOs and UN agencies received that money?
Again, I'd want to go through and give you the proper breakdown, but the partners that we rely on and provide the most assistance to would be the World Food Program, UNICEF, International Medical Corps, who, for example, are running a hospital in southern Gaza, seeing 600 patients a day. The partners, if we're talking about the humanitarian assistance, which is where we've surged assistance, we're talking about trusted partners that USAID works with all over the world.
So who are the individuals who have received cash?
The individuals would be, in the case of the World Food Program, which, you know, in order to keep markets going so that people are not forever dependent on humanitarian assistance, or to give people the ability to make it possible for markets to exist, these are voucher assistance programs, and they go to lists of beneficiaries who are identified by the World Food Program on the ground. So Gazan civilians.
Well, when you say Gazan civilians, how much of the aid, cash or otherwise, do you assess that has been diverted directly to Hamas?
We do not have reports from our partners about diversion by Hamas, and I would say as well that the government of Israel is not shy about presenting to us evidence of things that it finds problematic, UNRWA being the most glaring example. And this is not something that has come to our attention in other ways as well. And they are monitoring.
I will say
to be very clear, Senator, just if I could say one more thing. The government of Israel has eyes on everything that goes into Gaza. There's no other way in that doesn't go through COGAT. And so it's really important to bear that in mind, that the system that has been in place since October 7th is the most stringent and vigilant form of surveillance that I've ever seen in my
Okay, so you say you don't have any evidence, but if you take a look, you mentioned the poster board, and let's look at the USAID's own Inspector General says that Hamas diverts humanitarian assistance, specifically that the entire Gaza Strip is a, quote, high risk for potential diversion and misuse of U.S.-funded assistance. The State Department makes the very same assessment. When they restarted aid in 2021, over my objections and the objections of many others, they made an internal assessment that there was a, quote, high risk the aid would benefit Hamas. That's the Biden State Department, that's the USAID Office of the Inspector General. What are you doing to stop this money from going to Hamas? And to be clear, if you go online right now, you can see videos of Hamas terrorists riding on top of aid trucks. And so saying, we don't have any evidence this is happening, when your own agency says there's a high risk of this happening, that's not credible.
This is an entirely appropriate fraud alert in the most complex operating environment on planet Earth, which calls on USAID, the OIG staff themselves, and our partners to be excessively vigilant and to remind partners that they have to report
Do you agree with the Inspector General that there's a high risk of Hamas diverting the aid?
There's a high risk in any environment where you have armed elements. That risk is there. And in, again, this really, really unprecedented situation where you have such a small number of crossing points and such intense focus, not only on the aid as it crosses, but also on what happens to the aid, with IDF soldiers patrolling through Gaza.
You know, I have to say it's remarkable. You can't tell us how much money's gone into Gaza.
No,
you can't tell us what's happened to stop it from going to Hamas.
You asked a totally different question at the beginning. You said how much over the duration of the Biden
I asked it
administration.
both ways.
No, and then I answered. I said roughly around $100 million, which it looks like is on your poster board, saying this looks like that's what the Inspector General, the figure that he used as well. So my point is, this is exactly the right set of questions. This is our responsibility to prevent diversion, to look into any allegation. Our partners know that when something like that happens, they have to report it to the OIG and to USAID. And we have a set of investigation measures and remediation measures that we have to take when that happens. Look, what you have is severe hunger, desperate civilians. You definitely have, and again, the government of Israel itself, this is something I talked to the Prime Minister about, recognizes that the level of food scarcity in Gaza has made civilians act in a manner that has undermined the traditional humanitarian distribution system, where it's very hard for trucks even to get to their destinations because civilians come and charge the trucks, as you would and I would if our kids, or we might, if our kids were as hungry as kids in Gaza are. So I think the main, I don't want to call it assurance because we have to verify then trust, but the main point I would underscore is that the IDF is omnipresent in Gaza. The Israeli government is omnipresent in the humanitarian pipeline going to Gaza, and they retain the ability to keep track of what is happening on the ground, and they recognize that there's also a security and a huge stability risk, they appear to recognize, I hope they recognize, of allowing so little food to reach civilians who are in such dire straits.
Thank you.
I had mentioned earlier, Senator Booker, we thank you for your visit to Sudan and briefing many of us as to the current humanitarian crisis in that area. So we thank you for that, and you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this committee and Administrator Power. It's great to see you, but even more so, it's just been great to work with you and your extraordinary team who probably does not get the kind of attention and gratitude they deserve as well. So it's just, I'm grateful that you're here. Listening to some of my colleagues, I share their urgency and an urgency I know you share to deal with this gruesome, awful, tragic humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The urgencies are paramount to deal with the challenges, not just with the food insecurity and the near famine-like conditions, but also the medical needs, the trauma. There's no way we can ever get to the peace and strength in that region that we urgently need, or the independence and strength of the Palestinian people relies upon us addressing this crisis, and I'm grateful for your focus. But so many of the things that I'm saying also could be said about what's going on in Sudan right now. And it's a crisis in terms of proportion that's perhaps the fastest growing humanitarian crisis on the planet right now, at a scale and number that are even difficult to get your head around. As you know, the conflict is causing a spiraling towards mass famine in the Darfur region, which is accelerating the refugee problem into surrounding nations. As the chairman just said, I was in Sudan and have now talked to many leaders within the State Department as well as other aid workers who've been to that, where I've been, and all of us have the same thing. We've seen refugee camps from Syrian refugees in Jordan to, I've been around this globe, but none of us have seen anything like the level, the scale, the ocean of human crisis that we witnessed there. And what compounds this problem is it's not just the hunger crisis and the famine-like conditions, the increasing numbers, and about 90% of the people you see are women and children, and the growing numbers of people that are malnourished, facing starvation who come, but the endemic nature of the sexual violence that is also really apparent. And so we've talked about this in private conversations, but the desperation of the aid workers I encountered who don't know where the next resources are going to come from. Their needs are less than 10% funded. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that. And then the other area of questioning I want to do is you're dealing with a population that has been so traumatized and victimized and brutalized that the need is not just food and water, which is so apparent in that area that I witnessed in Adre, but I'm wondering how we can begin to address some of the larger issues of trauma that are so destabilizing the Sahel in general, that really put us into a crisis after Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, that had everybody that I visited in that region really concerned about how this crisis is going to further destabilize a region if we don't begin to address the full needs of the community of people who are suffering.
Well, I thank you, Senator, for traveling there, for also the number of senators who've spoken while you were out of the room about your trip and you briefing on the trip and the impression you've made on your colleagues, is part of what we need more of. There's not enough focus. It's a very hard time now to get attention, irrespective of the gravity of harm that you're suffering on planet Earth, because the needs are so substantial, up 40% this year from last year, and they were up last year from the year before, and it's the pace of increase is really staggering. There's very little good news or positive, I can say, I guess, about Sudan, except, I think you have engaged a lot with our new special envoy. Fundamentally, there has to be a political agreement. We're not going to humanitarian aid our way out of this humanitarian crisis. The guns have to fall quiet. Even a ceasefire, a protracted ceasefire would be something, would allow more access. So I'm grateful that Special Envoy Periel is on the case, and UN Special Representative also now have an empowered Special Envoy Lamamra. So that's politically, I think it's, again, just a process point. It doesn't get us anywhere until it does, but I think it's better than not having that senior engagement. There's also a pledging conference that the French are convening in Paris, as you probably know, on April 15th. So I mentioned that the U.S. government has given almost $1 billion over the last year, 600 million of which is from USAID, but we have not seen other donors step up and do their share. Again, everything is connected to everything else. With the war in Gaza, they might be funding UNRWA in a way that we are not, and they may say that when we say, what about Sudan? And so it's very, very complicated, just given the level of global need. But I absolutely share your assessment and sense of urgency. And on the psychosocial, just briefly, this is again the challenge, which is the sheer number of people dependent on, as you said, basic food and water or medicine to stay alive, and all programs come out of the same pot of money. In order not to carry their trauma and become potentially destabilizing members of their own community, or be susceptible to recruitment, or just to suffer for the rest of their lives, we need to supplement these life-saving interventions with life-changing and healing psychosocial support. We have programs like that in Sudan, but they're quite modest, again, given the access issues and the primacy of keeping people alive to get to the point where we can hopefully do some of that follow-on care.
I just want to be respectful of my colleague from Illinois, but just ask one more question. But in the town of Adre, on the border of Sudan and in Chad, Chad's already one of our top 10 lowest income countries. Less than 10% of the country is even electrified. And for people, it's so urgent for me to let folks understand that you even have Chad folks suffering such poverty going to see if they can get aid from the places that are being set up to deal with Sudan and Sudan refugees. It's such an interwoven crisis that could really affect that region. And so investments in humanitarian aid are really investments in economic security, political security, and basically dollars invested in supporting these populations save tremendously more dollars, not to mention the efforts of global competitors like Russia trying to exploit these areas. And so I guess the one thing I will ask you and then yield to my colleague, if you could just, I'm trying to get you on the record, and this implication for the world as well as for what I saw in Chad and the town of Adre is the supplemental. And a lot of people are casting the supplemental in terms of Indochina, in terms of Israel, Gaza, in terms of Ukraine. And these are all incredibly urgent moments that capture a lot of the attention of the public. But when it comes to the supplemental's urgency for what we see on the continent of Africa and the urgent importance of the continent of Africa, could you just speak to that, why keeping the humanitarian aid is so critical in the global context, but specifically for Africa.
If you could be brief, we would appreciate it.
I will.
We've covered it before.
Just to reinforce a point I made earlier, which is that the word supplemental in the context of humanitarian assistance is a misnomer, because our base humanitarian budget is down 40% in the 24 bill from what it was as enacted in FY23, and needs. We didn't have the war in Sudan a year ago. A year and a week ago, I guess we got it. But you know, this supplemental is not only a life and death issue for the kinds of refugees we've been able to sustain since that war began, but as you said, there are all these dogs that aren't barking because of U.S. leadership, and it's very hard to do the counterfactuals and so forth. But how many of the people who receive humanitarian assistance funded by the United States at these higher levels that we had last year, what happens when those rations get cut, when they can't show up and get access to resources? Where do they go? Where do the young men among them go? There are plenty of players on the scene, including Boko Haram, who had a horrific spate of attacks in Chad as well as in Nigeria and elsewhere. ISIS and its affiliates. I mean, this is a pool of individuals and who are themselves displaced, but also those host communities that have nothing to begin with, that we have to find ways to support to get through this crisis. But we can't just focus on the humanitarian without attention to the political, because the real challenge right now is wars aren't ending. They keep getting added to the ledger. Funding is actually going down, not up, even as needs are going up. And even with the supplemental, our funding will be down commensurate to the need. But investment in the diplomacy and the political processes as well to put enough pressure on those players who are causing this havoc and this devastation in the first place is key. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Administrator Power. As someone who focuses a great deal on the Indo-Pacific, I want to applaud the agency's focus on boosting economic growth, economic resilience, and economic connectivity between our allies and partners in the region. And I know firsthand that this economic work is important, and it's what our partners want. The request submitted includes $2 billion in mandatory funding over 5 years for state and USAID to support our economic strategy in the region. And I wanted to invite you to comment on how funding this request can provide real impact for countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, who are on the front lines of increasing PRC aggression.
Well, only because I've traveled not that long ago to Vietnam, I would just highlight the strategic upgrade in the relationship between the United States and Vietnam. And we mentioned earlier Cindy McCain, and I often think of Senator McCain, Senator Kerry, and the work that was done, to plant those seeds long ago. And now you have a comprehensive strategic partnership with Vietnam, investments in young people, in education, in their tech sector. I just met with senior Vietnamese officials here a couple weeks ago about their interest in building a semiconductor industry that can have profound impacts for us and our supply chain resilience. I mean, really, the sky is the limit, and the opening by the people, which is an incredible thing to experience, going to Vietnam all these decades after war and being so welcomed. One of the things USAID has done is invested in the war legacy issues, including remediation of the toxins that were left by Agent Orange in the war, and addressing communities who've been afflicted with disabilities and trying to support them. But just the potential for that relationship to move forward. The Philippines as well, a major upgrade I think we're seeing in those dynamics. And USAID's investments are, in marginalized communities, people who maybe haven't been part of economic growth, but as those countries seek to move toward more inclusive economic growth, for us to be there to build their national capacities to deal with disasters, particularly in light of climate change and all the extreme weather events. But again, I think we've come a long way, and a free and open Indo-Pacific is so entirely in the interest of the American people that it's something that we must continue to pursue.
Thank you. And sort of moving on from your comments about the post-war work that you're doing and the relationships that you're building, I'm interested in your perspective on interagency cooperation on the ground, especially across the 3 Ds of diplomacy, development, and defense, in places where USAID's public servants are working in challenging and often hostile environments. Those of us who have had boots on the ground appreciate the challenges of coordinating among multiple U.S. government agencies in conflict-affected areas. But despite the challenges, our national security strategy requires the effective and efficient use of all the elements of national power, including development assistance. Can you provide examples of successful interagency cooperation, particularly between USAID and the Department of Defense, in recent humanitarian or developmental efforts?
Well, let me say, I think we and the interagency progress every year on this and get stronger and stronger. I think the civ-mil ties among our agencies you might even find unrecognizable from the time of your service in the sense that they are much stronger. Just some examples, the number of detailees that we have from the Defense Department at USAID. We have a senior development advisor in each of the combatant commands around the world. And you asked for examples, the example of the large airlifts of supplies into Al-Arish in the early days of the Gaza war by DOD. USAID funded supplies on DOD planes, working that through. Obviously, the collaboration now on creating a maritime corridor into Gaza. I think I had mentioned earlier the number of natural disasters that afflict the Philippines. It's just and growing, it appears, every year. The work that DOD has done with its counterparts in building disaster resilience, and we, USAID, have done with our civilian counterparts. And I think the real testament to a 3D mindset is DOD being the one to consistently send the message of the importance of a civilian-led response when a national emergency, obviously militaries can have capabilities that need to be turned to in a difficult circumstance, but making sure that the response doesn't get overly militarized. Those kinds of messages coming from USAID is one thing, but coming from our defense colleagues just makes an enormous difference.
And I think it's also critically important in places like Africa, where you have some real security challenges for your personnel on the ground as well, I would expect.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Unfortunately, between coups and conflicts, the collaboration on basic questions of the security of USAID staff, US personnel more broadly, but also questions around evacuations and contingency planning, all of that is required and needs to be constantly updated in light of the circumstances.
Thank you, and thank you for your continued service.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, Ambassador Powell, let me make one comment here about the humanitarian crisis we have in Gaza. It's urgent. We've got to get aid in there. We've got to do a better job. But I mention that because currently there is active negotiations in regards to a pause in hostilities and the release of hostages. And it appears that Hamas is being extremely difficult. I would hope we would see more international pressure on Hamas to release the hostages so that we can move forward with closure for many Israeli families and many international families. There's 133 individuals that are still not accounted for. We expect we know some are deceased, we know some are alive. We've never had international organization accountability on these individuals. I mention that because it's just a horrific humanitarian crisis for the families of these hostages and the hostages themselves. And if we can get that resolved and we can get a pause, then we have a real chance to see major progress made in regards to the humanitarian crisis within Gaza. So we recognize we all need to do more. We need to pass our supplemental so that you have the resources you need. We recognize that may not be the immediate need in Gaza, but it's still affecting all the other programs that you have, and you don't have enough resources to do your basic international and humanitarian assistance. We have to do that. The Israelis have to be more understanding on the gates into Gaza and to allow for the distribution to take place. There's got to be more effective international presence in order to deliver that aid, which a pause in hostilities will allow us to be able to get all that done and to bring closure in regards to the hostages that Hamas took on October 7th in an horrific attack on Israel. So I just really want to underscore the point, we're all concerned about getting humanitarian assistance in. We have to deal with that. But let's also concentrate on Hamas, that was the terrorist attacks on October 7th, the taking of hostages, which was outrageous to start off with, including young children and including women, not, in many cases, civilians, not soldiers, and yet they still keep from getting home these individuals and allowing for closure for families on which we've had a deceased individual. They're responsible for their safety, and they're responsible for their immediate release. The record of the committee will remain open until end of the day tomorrow and end of Thursday. We would ask that the members get their questions in, and we ask, Madam Administrator, if you would respond promptly to those questions. We started this hearing by offering our thanks for what you do, and we recognize you operate in an extremely challenging environment. Every day there's new challenges that you have to confront. I was very impressed by your comments that we direct the pots of dollars as to where you can spend them for about 90% of your aid, so that makes it challenging for you to make certain adjustments. And we look forward to the FY25 budget to give you the resources you need to meet the challenges of America. With that, there's nothing further from my colleagues. The hearing will be adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.